Turn with me, please, to the book of Revelation and chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6, beginning to read at verse number 1. We're working our way through this amazing book of the Bible, and I trust that as we do so, we will come to a better understanding of what it actually teaches. So let's read from Revelation 6 and verse 1. John says, "Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures say with a voice like thunder, 'Come!' And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come!' And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come!' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine.' When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, 'Come!' And I looked, and behold, a pale horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a quarter of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth." So reads God's holy word. I don't know how well up you are on your Greek mythology, but if I were to say the words Pandora's box, some of you might have some idea of what I was talking about. Some of you haven't a clue maybe what I'm talking about. So let's begin with a wee bit of Greek mythology this morning. According to Hesiod, who was an ancient Greek poet and philosopher, whenever Prometheus stole fire from heaven, Zeus, supposedly the king of the gods, took vengeance by presenting Pandora, a beautiful female made into a human. He presented Pandora to Prometheus's brother Epimetheus. Pandora was beautiful, created by the gods, sent forth from the heavens. She was given a special box which she was told never ever to open. No human was ever to see what was inside the box. Now, of course, having been told not to open the box, Pandora being a woman and being a human being just like all of us, she decided, "I want to know what's in the box." So as her curiosity got the better of her, she eventually opened the box one day, and as soon as the lid was opened, the contents of the box were released. And although she tried her best to grab hold of everything and stuff it back into the box, she couldn't. And the box contained every evil imaginable: sickness, war, famine, oppression, disease, pestilence, cruelty, death. And now, having been released, these things were completely out of anybody's control. So according to Greek mythology, that's how evil and suffering and wickedness came to be in the world. It's here. It's part of the world. There's no real rhyme or reason to it. It's completely random, and it's certainly not under anybody's control. I'll come back to this later on in the sermon. In our last two studies of the book of Revelation, we've looked at chapter 4 and chapter 5. Chapter 4, the big theme, God is sovereign. He's king. He is on the throne. Chapter 4 was about the throne. Chapter 5 is about the Lamb. The Lamb is in the midst of the throne. The Lamb being Jesus Christ, crucified, but also now risen and exalted and raised back again to heaven, where he sits with God ruling. And he, through the merits of his redemptive work, he is able to open this great scroll that we discovered in chapter 5. Nobody else can open it. It is sealed with 7 seals. And this scroll contains God's plan for the whole of redemptive history. His plan for what's happening in the world now and what will happen right until the time when Jesus comes back. And in chapter 6, which we come to this morning, we see the Lamb, Jesus Christ, begins to open the seals of this scroll. And in opening the seals, he's not only revealing what's inside the scroll, he is putting into effect what is written in the scroll. In other words, he's bringing to pass what God has written with regards to the world's future. This morning we're going to look at the opening 4 seals, and I've entitled our sermon this morning, Equine Theology. Theology of horses. It's to do with what is often called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. You've heard that expression, I'm sure. The word apocalypse is simply the Greek word for revelation. In other words, the 4 horsemen of Revelation. Before we look at this passage in detail, first of all, we need to say this. You'll hear people speaking about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Sometimes you'll hear comedians making fun of and satirizing the biblical teaching of the end of the world, and they talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse raging through the world. Also, you will hear Christians whose understanding and theology of the book of Revelation is very different from what we would believe the book of Revelation to teach. And both those groups, those who are making fun of it and those who haven't a proper understanding of it, both of them believe that the whole idea of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is something that's going to happen out there in the future at some stage. That at some point in time, supposedly, these 4 horsemen are going to ride through the earth and all the destruction is going to come. Well, as I hope to show you this morning as we study this passage, that is not the case. In fact, as we shall see, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have actually been galloping throughout this earth for the last 2 millennia. And they are still today executing their terrible destructive powers. So let's look at this passage. Prior to becoming a Christian, I had a great interest in horses, but it wasn't the interest in horses that the likes of Leslie and Emmons have, where they'll raise horses and look after them and care for them and so on. It might seem strange to you that somebody brought up in a densely populated area of back-to-back terraced houses in East Belfast was interested in horses. But the horses I was interested in were those that ran at Goodwood and Epsom and Cheltenham and Ascot and other places like that. I used to study the form, as the saying goes. And I would read up on the horses and I would learn all I could about the horses before I would place a bet. And sometimes, if there was a race on TV, the camera would focus on one horse and the commentator would tell you all about that horse. And then the camera would zoom around to another horse and he would tell you all about that horse. Well, in this passage, that's what's happening. The camera is focusing on 4 different horses, and we're going to learn about each of them. Horse number 1 That's your first heading. Horse number 1. I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a white horse. Then he tells you something about the jockey. Its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. The Lamb opens the first seal of the scroll, and as he does so, one of the living creatures who's in the throne room of heaven booms out, "Come!" And having done so, immediately a horse and its rider appears. This horse is white. He's not given a name in the passage, but we're going to call the name of this horse Conquest. Conquest. Why? Because that is what this horse and his rider is all about. The rider upon the white horse possesses a bow, and he's wearing a crown. We're told that he comes out to conquering and to conquer. So the rider on this horse is destroying all that stand in his way, and he's determined to keep on killing and conquering. Now, in the ancient world, whenever a king went out to war, whenever he went out to do battle against another kingdom with a view to overthrowing that kingdom in order to extend the borders of his own kingdom, having succeeded in doing so, having won the battle, the victorious king would ride at the head of a victory parade on a horse. What colour was the horse? It was always white. The white horse with the victorious king on it was a symbol of political, military victory. It spoke of advancement. Now, the advancement came in the wake of brutal conflict, bloody massacre, and lots of death. It came in the wake of pain, suffering, anguish, sorrow, and loss, all those things that we associate with war. But the white horse signifies political and territorial conquest in the context of war. I don't know historically whether King Billy actually rode on a white horse, but all the banners of King Billy have him on a white horse, and the symbol of that is conquest, battle, victory. Horse number 1 symbolizes international war and conflict. It signifies political maneuverings, the seeking by those who are in political power of political and territorial advancement and all that's involved in that. Now, I don't know how many wars there have been in the 2,000 years that have passed since Christ's resurrection. I'm sure you can go on to Google it and you'll get some idea. But you can be sure of this, there have been thousands of wars. And think for a moment of all the pain and all the suffering and all the loss and all the sorrow and all the hardship and anguish and death that has occurred in this world and that ordinary people have experienced as a result of battles, tribal conflict, international conflict, civil war. This horse is alive and well and is galloping through the world today. At this very minute, this horse is galloping through the land of Ukraine. This horse has galloped over the fields of the Somme. It has cantered across the beaches of Normandy. Its hoof prints are all over the Balkan states. And it's cantered through most of Europe in the 1940s. We'll see the practical significance of all of this later. But friend, do not for 1 minute think that this horse waiting in the wings of the drama of history is only going to appear at some stage just before the return of Christ many years hence. No, this horse and its rider has already been sent forth and is riding throughout the world today. Now, at this point, I have a confession to make. Initially, when I came to prepare this sermon, I understood this white horse and its rider being sent forth to conquer in a different way. I thought it depicted the Lord Jesus Christ, the conquering power of the gospel. And it's true that later on in Revelation 19, Jesus is depicted as riding a white horse in victory. And there are commentators who believe that this is what this horse is all about. And I had most of my sermon written on Wednesday. And then I decided to read a few other commentaries and listen to a few other sermons, and I realized that my understanding of it was wrong. And it's good to realize you're wrong. I had to start writing it again. And what really convinced me that my initial understanding was wrong, and what I've just said before you is the true understanding, is the fact that all the pictures that we have in the book of Revelation are all rooted and grounded in the Old Testament. And in the book of Zechariah in chapter 6, these 4 horses appear pulling chariots, the same colours. And they are sent to bring God's judgment on the earth, not God's grace. God's judgment, his punishment. And that being the case, all 4 horses must be understood against this Old Testament background. So the white horse doesn't depict the gospel going out in victory. The interpretation, I believe, that is correct is that this horse depicts war, international conflict between nations. What about horse number 2? Let's pan away from number 1, verses 3 and 4. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come," and he came out another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. So the Lamb opens the second seal. And this time, the second horse appears. This horse is red, blood red. We called the first horse conquest. We'll call this horse murder. Murder. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another. Now, because the first horse symbolizes war, the second horse can't symbolize war, but it clearly symbolizes the deliberate taking of human life. It talks about people slaying one another. And what you have here is a deliberate taking of human life by other humans in contexts other than that of war, but where there is strife between them, where there is discord, where peace no longer prevails between individuals or between groups of people aggrieved with others and who act on their own initiative and not the government's initiative. So, for example, you have murder carried out by one person on another, slaying one another for any number of reasons. People are murdered because of hatred, revenge, greed, jealousy, psychosis, sexual pleasure, anger, mental illness. It may be murder carried out by a terrorist organization seeking to achieve a specific religious or political goal. One thinks of 9/11. One thinks of the murders that are carried out regularly, but which aren't featured very much on the news, by Boko Haram, a militant Muslim organization in Nigeria. One thinks of the many who are murdered by paramilitary organizations in our own land during what we call the Troubles. One thinks of killings by crime gangs, drug barons, the mafia, child abusers, rapists, husbands wanting revenge on a wife who's been unfaithful, children who are murdered by their parents in order to get the family inheritance, spouses who have been murdered for the insurance money on their life policy, murders on one's own people, millions by Stalin. That wasn't war, that was just murder. By Mao Zedong. It's going on every hour of every day in every country in the world. Tijuana in Mexico, the world's most murderous city. Don't go there for your holidays. El Salvador, the country that has the most murders of all the countries in the world. The world is full of murder. It has always been the case. John Lennon, he sang Imagine, nothing to kill or die for. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. You're glad I didn't sing those words. John, you are a dreamer. John Lennon, you were not living in the reality of a fallen, sinful, broken world, because the rider on the red horse has taken peace from the earth. And as he rides, people slay one another. There will always be something to kill for, always be some reason to die at someone else's hand. That is what this world is like. We don't have to wait until the end of time for this to happen. Every day, somewhere in the world, there will be news reports of murders that have taken place. And when those reports take place, you hear the clatter of the hooves of the red horse. Horse number 3, verses 5 and 6. And there we read about the black horse. What will we call this horse? The first horse we called conquest. The second we called murder. We call this horse famine or scarcity. It's obvious why I've called this famine or scarcity, isn't it? The rider has scales in his hand, but they're not the scales of justice that we normally associate with Lady Justice, who's on top of the Old Bailey, or who's carved into some of the frescoes outside courtrooms. These are commercial scales. They're used for weighing out produce such as grain, wheat, barley, oats, or other edible foodstuffs. And what's going on in this scene? Well, someone, and we'll discover in a moment who this is, someone announces the current rate at which 2 of the most basic sustenance products, wheat and barley, are to be sold. As far as wheat's concerned, you get a quart of it for 1 denarius. If you want barley, you'll get 3 quarts of it for a denarius. Now, all of that means nothing to us, really. But let me put it into understandable terms. A denarius was an average day's wage for an ordinary worker in the first century. A quart of wheat was just enough to bake enough bread for 1 person for a whole day. 3 quarts of barley was enough to feed 1 family for a whole day, but it wasn't very nourishing. Not as nourishing as wheat. It was inferior. It was the watered-down soup as opposed to a stew. Now, translate that into today's terms. You're talking about a small loaf of bread that will feed 1 person, costing about £50. What an average working-class person earns in a day, taking a wage of £250 a week. If you get more than that, then the price of the loaf's even more. And if my maths is right, and it may not be, then if a loaf normally costs £1, I know it's a bit dear now, but it used to be you get a loaf for £1 in Tesco's and other supermarkets as well. Then the inflationary rate here in the first century, equivalent of today, is 5,000%. 5,000%. That's what happens when you have famine conditions. That's what happens when food is scarce. Prices skyrocket. But notice, the writer isn't to touch the wine and the oil. What's that all about? Well, you see, an ordinary family couldn't afford wine and oil. They were luxuries. It was only the well-to-do that could buy such items. And during this time of scarcity, there will be those, the well-to-do, the rich, who will continue to be able to indulge in luxuries while the majority of ordinary people are on the brink of starving. In other words, you'll have a world where you have the haves and the have-nots. Cost of living doesn't often affect the well-to-do. Cost of living increases. There always has been inequality in this world. I somehow don't think that Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer or most Premier League footballers or rock stars or movie stars are worrying too much about the fact that the price of electric and gas and petrol and bread and milk are going up. But many, many people are considerably affected by it. Those who struggle in the current economic climate struggle even more in cases of high inflation. And the point of the black horse is this: our world will be a world where there's inequality and where there's scarcity, where there's price rises, where there are famines in the world, hyperinflation, people in dire need. This horse has walked through Ethiopia. At another time, it has walked through South Sudan. It has been in southern Madagascar, the Yemen, Somalia. And there was even a time when it walked the length and breadth of Ireland in the mid-19th century, the potato famine. That brings us to the fourth horse, verses 7 and 8. The Lamb opens the fourth seal. The fourth living creature cries, "Come," and at his command, the last horse appears. And this horse is described as being pale. The colour that it really points to is a sort of a greyish-green colour, or ashen. It's a colour of a body when a person dies. And we're told that this horse, or at least the rider on this horse, is called Death. So that's what we'll call it. Death. And we're told that he's followed by Hades. Hades is just another word for the grave, the place of the dead. So this horse, like the other horses, deals with death. He's riding along, and as he rides along, the grave is like a huge trailer coming behind him, being constantly filled with bodies. It's quite a common thing here in the summer months to see a tractor going across a field cutting silage, and the grass being cut, being spewed into a huge trailer that collects everything that's been mown down. That's the picture here. This horse is riding along, and the grave is sweeping up all that comes after him. The modus operandi of this horse, how he brings about death, is through sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. And in Ezekiel chapter 14 and 21, we read this: "For thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 disastrous acts," in other words, God's punishment, "of judgment, sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence." In other words, this is the judgment of God on the earth. Death taking place in all sorts of ways, through conflict, scarcity of food, being attacked by animals, pestilence, viruses, pandemics. The ordinary fact that death happens. AIDS, COVID-19, smallpox, influenza, Marburg, rabies, dengue plague, cancer, and so the list goes on. Add to that heart attacks, Alzheimer's, ND, road traffic accidents, what we call natural causes. It all adds up to a terrible harvest of the grim reaper. This is what these four horses stand for. This is what they symbolize. War, murder, terrorism, interpersonal strife and conflict, famine, scarcity of food, inflation, poverty, death, the grave, all these things. And they're here now. This isn't something that's going to happen at some point in the future. This is happening now. War and conflict and murder and famine and disease and death, these are all part of God's outworking of his plan. And it's the Lamb who is in control of these things. He's the one who sends the horsemen out. He's the one who controls what they're allowed to do. He's the one who determines the rate of inflation when the black horse of famine comes into the earth. He's the one who says, don't touch this product, touch that product. What we have here is the Lamb's control over God's plan. We might be tempted to look at the world we live in and say, it's all a mess. We might be tempted to turn on our televisions and listen to the news and to see and hear about terrible atrocities that are happening in Ukraine or in Nigeria. Or we might look at the skeleton frames of adults and children who haven't had food in weeks. We might see packed hospitals full of suffering at the latest viral outbreak, or read about another child who's been taken and abused and murdered. And we think, is God really in control of this world? Yes, he is. The Lamb is in the midst of his throne. But part of his rule, part of his governing of this world includes the sending of partial judgments on the earth in the here and now of everyday life as a warning of the coming, even more terrible ultimate judgment that one day will take place. We don't live in a part of the world where there are earthquakes or tornadoes. But if we did, we would know this, that before an earthquake comes, there are usually little tremors that warns that there's going to be a massive earthquake. Or before a tornado comes into a town, sweeping through it and destroying everything. And I have seen what it's like when that happens when I was in America a number of years ago. Before the tornado comes, there's the wind begins to build and there's the stronger blowing. And it's a warning. It's a warning of what is about to explode upon you. Small quakes, small rumblings are warnings of something catastrophic that's about to happen. And that's what all these things that are in this world are meant to be to us. Wars and conflict and murders and famine and plagues and pandemics and death. They're all warning tremors of God's ultimate judgment that is coming on this world. The Greeks tried to explain it through Pandora's box. Something in the world completely out of anybody's control. Friend, there is all kinds of suffering in this world, but it is not out of control. It's under the control of the Lamb, who, whilst he controls it, is not the cause of it, nor the reason for it. All of these things ultimately come down to sin. Putin's sin for wanting to invade Ukraine because of his greed and because of his pride. A man's sin who wants to murder his wife because of his hatred and because of his revenge or whatever it happens to be. These partial judgments of God in this world are actually gracious warnings of what one day is going to happen. Think about it. If God didn't send any pre-warnings, if everything was going on nicely and there was none of these things, and suddenly one day there was judgment, you'd say, what kind of a God was that? He didn't even warn us. These 4 horses, if you listen, you can hear their hooves today. So when you turn on your television, when you listen to your radio when you're out in the car or in the tractor and the news comes on, or when you pick up a newspaper or go to your social media platform and see and hear and read of war, famine, murder, conflict, diseases, earthquakes, tsunamis, terrorist bombings, or when you're standing at the graveside of someone you know and love, pay attention. What you are hearing are the canter of the hooves of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse who are now roaming through the earth and who are saying to us, there is a judgment coming much, much worse than anything you have seen before. And in the passage from Matthew that we read, Jesus said, you need to be ready. You need to be ready. Many of us are ready, praise God, but some of you aren't ready. And next week, when we come to the 5th and 6th seals, we'll see how terrible the day of judgment is going to be. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, equine theology. You can learn a lot from horses. May God bless his word to our hearts. Amen. Let's turn to our final psalm.